years and haven't moved forward with testing. We have a number of other companies who have recently expressed interest in testing at the site. And we're hoping that we'll have someone in there probably in 2020 at the moment, based on recent conversations. Sort of, when we were focusing on the south side, we got questions from people saying, are you going to keep the north side? And that came up with the territorial sea plan. It's kind of, do we take the north side out if it's not going to be used? And Andy asked me really to talk about what we see, what PacWave sees as the value and what we see moving forward with PacWave North. And we do definitely see a role for it. It's in part 5, it's sort of described as a experimental marine renewable energy device test site, including looking at the environmental effects of devices. And that's still true, and we still intend to continue moving forward with people testing prototype devices there, or smaller scale devices, as Jason said. There are, not everything is large scale utility scale devices. There are these what were called alternative markets and are now being called by Department of Energy maritime markets, which I'll get into in a second. We also see a lot of value at somewhere like the north side for technology, not directly the devices themselves, but other research and testing around those devices. And a critical piece of that is things like mooring systems. A lot of developers clearly focus on their device, and that's understandable. A lot less research and thinking has gone into things like mooring systems. There was one developer who did look very closely at their mooring system. There was the Palamas device in Europe, and they came up with a mooring system where they could either put their device on the mooring or take it off in something like 20 minutes. And that's not something most developers think about, but it's going to be very critical in Oregon, where your weather windows are tight, and you can't spend a day or 2 days putting a device on once you've got your mooring out there. It needs to be slicker and faster. So there's definitely potential research opportunities at the north site to look at things like moorings, to look at instrumentation, and also to look at basic operation and maintenance procedures. So there's lots of opportunities at the north side for that. And then we have what is really becoming important, which is the maritime markets. And Department of Energy, while still very much behind the utility scale device development, are also very interested in these maritime markets. And as part of that, Department of Energy have been in discussions with us to find funding to basically revitalize the north side and get it up and running again. They see it as a critical piece of the industry. So the maritime markets are, they're often smaller devices. They focus on electricity production or fresh water in some cases, in areas where it's very, very valuable, and normally in areas or applications that are power limited or are served by importing fossil fuels, basically diesel generators in like small communities in Alaska. And as Jason said, there's a whole list of these maritime markets, and I have a copy of the DOE preliminary report here, but if you search maritime markets in the Department of Energy, they have a pretty substantial draft report about how this could fit in, how wave energy technology or tidal in other areas could work with these maritime markets. Jason mentioned things like ocean observing buoys and navigational buoys and powering things like that. You also have opportunities for having charging stations for underwater autonomous vehicles. Sending a vessel out there is costly. If you can put instrumentation out there that can either carry out inspections or carry out routine maintenance autonomously, one of the limitations is the power that they consume and running out of power. You can have bottom-mounted recharging stations. They do their work, they come back, they sit themselves down on the recharging station, batteries are recharged, maybe transmit data back to shore, and then they can keep going out there without putting the vessel out on site. Desalination is an interesting application of these maritime markets, and there are developers who are looking at putting devices close to shore, pumping water to shore. Some of that pressurized water is used to generate electricity, and the rest of it goes into the desalination plant to produce fresh water. Critical in areas of the world where you don't have the electrical infrastructure and where there is not fresh water. Other applications, providing electricity to support aquaculture, data centers. Recently Microsoft put a prototype data center underwater at STMEC in Scotland. These use a huge amount of power, so it can be provided with power from wave energy or tidal energy devices, and they create a lot of heat, so basically sinking them to the bottom of the sea with the heat issues. A critical sort of maritime market is the disaster resilience and recovery. Smaller devices that can be rapidly deployed off the coast to generate relatively small amount of electricity, but it could be to power field hospitals, depending, maybe a raise to power local hospitals, particularly relevant to Oregon if the Cascadia subduction zone happens and power's cut off to the coast when it happens. Yeah. The ability to have smaller scale, rapidly deployable power to deal with such emergencies. And then there's a community scale power, like Jason talked about, small communities in Alaska that are reliant on diesel power, small power generation for those. And also even utility scale for islands, Hawaii, the US Virgin Islands, lots of places where electricity is expensive, you could supplement it. None of these necessarily would be implemented in Oregon or at the north site, but the technology could be developed and tested and refined at the site. So we see a lot of potential use at the north site. We're just reapplying for a lease from DSL for 15 years to keep it within the suite of facilities that we can offer to developers. And it's also important for us, with the wave energy devices, they're not moving ahead as quickly as we would like. There's not thousands of them lining up to test. So it's important to diversify the facilities that we can offer to people and attract a diverse market of people who want to come and test at our site. So we want to keep the north site going. We think there's a lot of potential, and the combination with deepwater site at our south site, the north test site in Camp Rilea means that wave energy testing should be pretty strong and continue to be strong in Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it is important for us to understand as we look forward to the future of Part 5, what the potential demand may be, the situation, and the future of the north site. We want to learn that. And I also want to thank all of our panelists for their input as we kind of wrap our minds around Part 5. It is going to be a topic for future OPAC meetings where we're going to need to take action. So this background information is intended as a foundation to inform those discussions. So thank you all for participating. I think what we'll do now is invite all the panelists up and then open the floor to OPAC questions that members may have.
Gina, before we start, during the time in which Jason and Dan were speaking, I actually wanted to provide some additional background on that issue with respect to the findings that were made by the Commission as to the OPAC recommendation. I know Steve's not here, and I'll mention this to Steve. I referenced the agency brief, but I went back through Jim Rue's order from October 2013, which was actually made on behalf of the Commission as the findings that were utilized in adopting Part 5. And I'm going to read from Jim Rue's order as to the findings he made with respect to the OPAC recommendation prior to it being modified by the agency. And here's what he says on page 15 of his order. Quote, "The issue with the OPAC recommendation was not that they did not carry out the policies in ORS 196.405 to 196.505, but that they were so protective of marine renewable resources that they did not, in the Commission's view, provide a sufficient but limited opportunity for marine renewable energy resources within the territorial sea." So apparently, according to the Commission, OPAC was too protective of Goal 19. Page 16, quoting Jimru again, one of the findings he made with respect to the OPAC recommendation prior to it being modified. The OPAC REFSA site recommendations also would achieve a high level of protection for resources and uses, and specifically the protection of marine renewable resources over marine renewable energy development. They, meaning the OPAC site recommendations, carry out the policies of ORS 196.415 and 196.420. However, the OPAC REFSA site recommendations would limit the areas where marine renewable energy projects could site to an extent that is more protective than required by the applicable statutes in Goal 19. As a result, the Commission had the discretion to expand the REFSA areas on a limited basis, so long as it could make the findings as required by ORS 196.471. So in essence, OPAC did its job too well, and that's why it was modified in 2013. And this is based on Jim Rue's order on behalf of the Commission that was submitted in 2013. This isn't my words, this is the words of the Commission.
Thank you. So Terry, then Patty.
We haven't talked for a while, Jason. What's the status of the wind energy? You talked wave energy a little bit, but wind energy that was trying to be developed off California. Is there anything gone on there, or have they given up, backed off?
The floating offshore wind is what we're talking about here, not bottom mounted. It's too steep of a diametry to accommodate bottom mounted technology. So we're talking about a wind turbine that's sitting on some sort of floating platform, and there are this many ways to do that. California market is a very big prize, and there's a lot of interest in floating offshore wind in California. The short answer, Terry, is it's almost full steam ahead. And there's been a lot that's happened just in the last week or so, and I'll tell you about that. In the shortest version I can, given my propensity for speaking, is that the state of California got behind offshore wind, at least at a planning level, a couple of years ago, and identified a number of areas that seemed least conflicted for offshore wind, all in about the 20-mile range offshore. The magic about that number is just kind of where these things have been more or less targeted for distance from shore. The sites looked really good, and the industry got pretty excited about this, and they started engaging. Then the Navy came out with some maps in late 2017 that basically claimed the entire southern half of California. If you look at the Monterey Bay Sanctuary, it's big, right? It comes down 100 miles or so south of San Francisco, and from that point forward, the Navy claimed it all. It's all red. It said these areas are important to our missions, training. Now, that's not the end of the story. The Navy does not have jurisdiction over the Outer Continental Shelf. The Department of Interior does, BOEM. Navy has the ability to stop a project there, but it would require a signature by somebody pretty far up the food chain that says we're not going to let the state do something out on the OCS because it impacts national security. Essentially what would have to happen. Meanwhile, Northern California is where the wind resource is. It peters off pretty quickly on there around Morro Bay, and Northern California all the way up to Coos Bay, some of the best wind resource in the entire world. So right now there are two projects that are proposed in California, one by Trident Winds, the other by Principal Power. Principal has the northern proposal. Trident has a southern proposal, which is off Morro Bay. They proposed that a couple of years ago. It's smack dab in the middle of one of the red zones. So a couple other things here, and I'll finish up. California just passed SB 100. It essentially says California will be 100% carbon-free on its energy generation by 2045. That's a big deal. It's a really big deal for California. They already had a high standard, I think it was 50. Now they've gone to 100. That makes the renewable energy community very happy, right? Because there will be a demand for clean energy. It certainly doesn't harm the offshore wind sector in California. It opens prospects for the sector, so I think they're pretty exciting. Secondly, the Navy is starting to move a little bit. So that's why I spent all day yesterday in a room full of Navy people in the offshore wind sector trying to find ways to move forward in those areas off Morro Bay. There's a lot of generation onshore there, Diablo Canyon Nuclear and San Onofre Nuclear. San Onofre already came offline. Diablo Canyon comes offline in 2025. That's 2 gigawatts of generation. That's a lot of generation. And you have a whole host of natural gas facilities on the shore that are coming offline for a variety of reasons. So I'm hearing 16 gigawatts of generation that will be coming offline in the next 10 years. You have load proximate there. You got LA, San Diego, San Francisco. It's all right there. You got grid intertie. So that's why the industry is focused on South Central California. Northern California is the prize, but there's no transmission to grid. We're talking about Eureka, Humboldt County. You got one line that runs out to the I-5 transmission line. It's already limited, and the only way to open up that whole thing is if we built $1 billion worth of transmission. And we're going to build $1 billion of transmission. The question is it there, or is it someplace like Wyoming and bring in terrestrial wind, or more down southeast, going into Arizona or elsewhere to bring in solar. So that's the play there. South Oregon is very much known, understood to the sector. They're well aware of the wind resource. They're aware of the complexity of doing a project in Oregon based upon hydropower costs, low power costs in general, having to compete with that. But the wind resource is really good. And as you talk about expanding the California grid, we call it regionalization. It's a big topic in the energy world right now. California almost passed the regionalization bill 3 weeks ago. They didn't, but it'll be that. Tying California essentially to the entire West so that energy can go anywhere at any time, making everything much more efficient. That's the simple version, but it has complexities associated with like jurisdiction, right? Autonomy. Why would California give up control of its own grid to anyone else? And that fundamental question has to be answered. And the same question would be asked by anybody who owns their own grid. There's 37 ISOs, they're not really ISOs, but the equivalent of in the Northwest. So it's a complex story, but regionalization is happening as well, and it opens up markets for energy generation elsewhere, including Oregon.
It's an ISO.
Independent System Operator is the entity that runs the grid.
Thank you.
And BPA is a sort of a local ISO. It's not really an ISO, but it functions like an ISO.
Thank you all for being here. I have 2 questions. One for Jason, and I can partly challenge Chris Wall, who's not able to be here today from NOAA. So I have a question for you. In the proposal that staff recommendation from the Department of Land Conservation and Development to the Commission, there's some changes. We're recommending, the staff is recommending going from 4 REFSs to 2, maintaining Camp Riley and Lakeside, 1 near Coos Bay and 1 near Astoria, Port of Astoria, 2 draft ports. Also going from 3% maximum build out in the territorial sea to 2%. Wanted to know if, and I'm sure Chris and No will be interested to know too, does the marine renewable energy feel that that's adequate and can they be supportive of those changes?
I would be inflating my significance if I told you I could speak for the industry. I'm not here to say what the industry thinks about this stuff. I can't. With that said, our original position was all, I mean, we haven't talked about these, of course, in 6 years. The original position always was, of course, diversity of sites, flexibility in siting was what we wanted. Once we got into the pathway of essentially zoning the ocean and exclusionary areas and actually settling on areas that we were setting aside or elevating as most appropriate for offshore, for marine renewable energy, that's, you know, something?
No.
You know, that process resulted in, you know, 4 sites, one of which was the OPT site. We always wanted more, right, because more is better. More flexibility, more opportunity. Today, I can't speak to NOAA's concerns about whether that number is adequate to accommodate the industry. I mean, I think that's kind of what the question from NOAA's perspective is. I don't know the answer to that. I think that the having adequate testing facilities, having some pathway forward for the energy, for the sector to continue to deploy and learn from deployments, which we know is really the most important thing that happens, is key. And I think that the test sites provide that. Camp Riley provides that. I think Nestucca is not a test site. It would have been a commercial deployment site. Lakeside has always been a little marginal because of access to grid crossing across the dunes there. It was never optimal, but adequate. It was always my position on that, and I probably haven't changed my opinion.
Thank you.
Patty, let me follow up on that point. So back, and I remember this very well since I was chairing the working group and also involved on TestBack. During the entire process in which we were trying to reach these REFSA sites, it was indicated to us by Chris Wall on behalf of NOAA, so I would have a question for Chris at some point. And it was also advocated on behalf of the governor's office when Richard Whitman was still in the governor's office, that we had to find a number of sites with varying capabilities so that we would be compliant with the national policy for marine renewable energy under the Coastal Zone Management Act. My question is, have things changed since 2013, in which now what's being proposed, which I think it's nice to have lesser sites, is going to be compliant with Chris Wall's previous position, or is her position on behalf of NOAA changed? I think that's probably something we need to find out, and I don't think this is a question for Jason. This is really a question for NOAA, which was the one that was advocating this from day one during this entire process. More REFSA sites were required.
I'll just respond to that. We've been in communication with NOAA, of course, because we knew what the staff recommended,
Sure.
where the staff was headed, and so when we touched bases with them, they said, well, there isn't a specific number. They just need to be able to pass the red phase test that the plan doesn't prohibit a use, in this case, marine renewable energy. And so they are looking at it. It was great part. We sent them the staff report, we sent them the map, we sent them the red line, the black line version that you all have, exactly what was in your packet we sent to them. And so I don't think that anything has changed per se, but that is what they would be doing, just to make sure, and that's why, you know, I think it's important to know that the marine renewable energy is the same. This is worthless. You know, if they feel that what we're you know, providing for testing, that we're providing, you know, enough options, we're not absolutely prohibiting it everywhere, that, you know, we're hoping that NOAA will give us the nod. And I don't know if Chris is online and wants to say anything. Okay.
Yeah, my 10 card is up for Chris Wall.
Okay, good.
So she's on the line
Good.
and
Okay.
able to speak.
Good.
Thank you. Dave, I'm online, so I'm here. I'm sorry, I'm not able to be there in person. I was out there yesterday and couldn't be there today. But I think Patty actually just captured it very well, so well done, Patty. Thank you. Our standards have not changed.
Sorry, Chris, hold on a second. I'm trying to increase your volume in the room here.
Okay.
All right, try now.
Okay. Is this any better? Are
Yeah.
you able to hear me now?
Yeah.
It is, thank you.
The bottom line is in the NOAA standards for review to be able to approve state policies and incorporate them into the state coastal program.
Right.
So that, as you all learned yesterday, you're able to use the enforceable policies for federal consistency. Then in a situation like Part 5, we need to make sure the policies are not discriminating against a particular industry or a particular use or activity, in this case offshore marine renewable energy. And so, as I stated in the process before, and then as Patty clarified now, whatever changes happen to Part 5, when it comes back to us, NOAA will be looking to ensure that energy is not essentially being prohibited offshore because either the policies are so restrictive or there's so many pollution areas that it needs to pass what Patty was saying, that really that red face test, or the straight face, is there actually a legitimate opportunity for renewable energy offshore in Oregon? We were able to approve it in its prior form, and we're looking now at the changes that are being proposed.
I actually had another question. This is for David, and perhaps others as they come up later. What's happening?
Which David?
Oh, I'm sorry, David Allen. I'm not going to address findings, even though they are important, and I realize that, but I'm not going to address those at this point. I'm trying to get to the substance. Do you, with the changes that are being proposed, are there remaining issues that you have with the substance, aside from findings?
You know, I would have to probably leave that to a lot of other folks. Now, I know with the cable issue and NBC Cables, that was, their primary issue was, you know, the impacts not having that language in there. And I can't speak for Scott, you know, Terry's here, he's on the board. I think going into the exclusion area perhaps did address that particular concern, because now it's pretty much excluded, you know. So that might have been a positive development. The REFSA sites, which was the other big difference of opinion. I know we talked about there was just minor things. I would say, substantively, I know that Camp Riley, it gets back to the OPAC recommendation. Camp Riley was not supported unanimously by OPAC. The Camp Riley alternate, a much smaller footprint, was to keep it out of some of the high-level crabbing grounds. So we're getting into the tension between allowing renewable energy and the impacts it would have on our Goal 19 resources. And OPAC was always focused on Goal 19 as required under state law. There were other elements coming in trying to promote renewable energy adverse to Goal 19. And that's what I read just out of Jim Rue's report. We were too protective of Goal 19 apparently. And they wanted to lessen that protection to allow marine renewable energy in some of these areas. That's the ongoing tension we have even to this day. So I would say for Camp Riley, I would leave it up to the folks up in that area to determine whether Camp Riley as being proposed is sufficient or whether the Camp Riley alternate would be better. But again, it really gets back to making the necessary findings to move forward. And if that needs to be done, then as I said earlier, the commission would probably have to revisit its previous findings and maybe make new findings to actually move forward procedurally compliant with the statute.
Thank you. Walter is next.
Yeah, my question's for Dan. You know, we saw the 5-year process for test pack and TSP and all those other sites. Can you, for historical perspective, tell us about how Nan's set, about how quickly that worked?
Putting me on the spot. It was a little before my time, but I know with NETS there had been a lot of interest from OSU and a lot of effort working with communities discussing the options of having a test site. I believe the initial thought was to have a grid-connected test site, but that was clearly not going to work with the area that was identified, which is really how the mobile ocean test berth, our Ocean Sentinel device, developed. With the south side, there was a big effort, again, just before my time, led by Belinda Batten and working with Katie Jacobson from Seaground, talking to communities and doing outreach to find out whether various communities were interested in the idea of having a grid-connected wave energy test site. And a number of communities were considered, and it finally came down to Reedsport and Newport. And both places put together committees to develop proposals to have the test site in their community. And I believe it was late 2012,
Yes.
early 2000. Yeah, when the
Early
final
2013.
early 2013, when the final decision was made to move to locate it in Newport. And you know, we continue working with you know, the fishing community, FI in particular, and local stakeholders in an effort to, you know, stay in their good books and keep the project moving forward in a way that's, you know, supported by the community and that's going to meet sort of the interests and goals of everyone involved. I probably haven't really answered your question, Walter, but that's as good as I can do.
No, it was just a historical perspective for everybody and how, you know, part of the OPAC decision was we did embrace the research before the development from a historical perspective. Thanks, Dan.
Actually, I have my pen up for the next question. And so my question for you, whenever we go back to redoing part 5, which there's the short term and there's kind of the long term review, will there be an effort to incorporate new data and information? So I feel like a lot has been done since 2013 to study energy in other places and also in Oregon. So I guess the question is to Andy. Like, I assume all those new data layers and all these new things will be incorporated at that time. Is that correct?
When there is new data available, the state always strives to make that accessible and relevant for the decision-making at the time. You bring up an interesting point, however, with the plan review criteria, and I think that's one of the other things that we should think about, because I don't know that we need necessarily to go back to do a resource inventory evaluation given today's kind of data sets. I think there's been some information that's been added, but it's been mostly outside of the territorial sea, work by the fisheries councils and development of their own proposals for management. But the plan review criteria is something I think we should all be thinking about, because the language in the proposed amendments is 7 years from the date of adoption, or 2% built, 1% built out.
Yeah.
So there's a criteria there, and I think if we recommence and readopt Part 5, do we want to be doing that review from 7 years from the initial adoption, or do we want to do it 7 years from today's date? And I think that's a question for all of us to consider. I don't see an immediate need to do a 2-year review in a couple of years, like, you know, because we're coming up on that original 7-year time period. I would actually ask Dan or Jason if they think that would be appropriate, but something to consider.
Well, and I know the 7-year discussion is somewhat controversial. Like, do we start counting then? Do we start counting now? Since it's been invalidated, does the clock restart? So I'm not trying to start that debate.
No.
I'm just trying to ensure that when it does happen, it's gonna, all this will be updated. And one of the things I don't know if what will happen is at that time, there might be amendments to some of these boundaries to accommodate new information. So I'm just trying to make that point as we move forward, that this is not a static, these pictures on the map aren't static, they're iterative, and we'll be going through processes in the future to deal with that.
Yeah, we always said that if there's new information available that would change our spatial framework, that we would make that change when it occurred, when the actual driver of the data set. And an excellent example is maybe a new cable gets laid. If a new cable gets laid, then that spatial framework will change to recognize the fact that there's now a cable corridor in that place.
Gina, just one comment. Regardless of what the Part 5 says, under the statute, OPAC still has the responsibility and duty to look at any part of the territorial sea plan if it's necessary. And I know Steve and I, that's something we agree on, obviously, is it's up to OPAC and the agency to determine if they want to review Part 5 separate from whether there's any mandatory requirements to do so. It's discretionary and it's under statute.
Terry?
May I? Regarding new information and the mapping process, other than PacWave, there's been extensive studies of that site, better understanding what's happening there, background studies, and, for purposes of applying for the FERC license for gold rates to deploy there. Riley also has had some work done. I'm not aware of much in the way of new data layers that would contribute along those lines. But what has happened is a lot of work on, called the state of the science of the environmental impacts of marine renewable energy. There's a lot of work that's happened there over several years, several documents, new database called HEPIS, Annex 4. It's a nationwide, international effort to better understand the interactions of marine renewable energy with the ocean. Some of the issues that we talked about once upon a time, like EMF, well entanglement, they're not talked about so much anymore whenever we're applying for applications because there's a lot better understanding of the risk. That doesn't mean there's no risk, it just means that we have a lot better understanding. So I'm not quite sure how that gets rolled into any further work except for on a case-by-case basis when we're applying for a project. The other area of information is just the functionality of the machines themselves and how they integrate with the grid. What does wave energy power look like when it goes on the grid? And so that's, again, probably not something that finds its way into a mapping assessment, but in just the overall viability of technology and how it impacts the ocean.
So this question, Chris Wall maybe will answer, but if you reflect back on the time you put in on this project, we did all these sites. We didn't have the existence of PacWave or a test site in the state of Oregon. And we don't have one for wind energy. There's every environment, I don't care where you are in the world, is somewhat different in how it implements on a device, both biologically and physically. So, do you think we wound up with the same sites for test sites if we'd have known that a test site path was going to be available for us? And would that have changed where we sit today in the territorial seaplane? That's a loaded question.
Well, I'll start, and of course, at the time, we believed that it was more imminent than it really was, right? OPT being a good example. I think that PacWave is such an obvious good decision in so many levels, right? It's how things should move forward. But that at the time wasn't necessarily on the table. It was not on the table. It was not even a glimmer in anybody's eye at that time.
It wasn't.
A grid-connected site in open ocean. WETS existed in Hawaii. There was a 30-meter site, and that was the only thing in the United States. And of course, part of the effort was to make sure that companies that were, Oregon-based companies had a place to test in Oregon, not go to Europe, where there was extensive testing capability there, and there still is. It's still really the international leader. But it doesn't change my position on, say, Camp Rylea, which is unique, and an excellent opportunity in the site that we ought to make sure that we protect this in terms of its functionality for marine energy. If you're going to change that site, please, I encourage you to work with Camp Rylea, who testified at TestPac and at LCDC on their interest in that site, and we have tested there, and there are companies that plan to test there moving forward. So it's an important site, and I hope it's not altered without some input from industry and from Camp Rylea National Guard.
Could I just jump in a little bit, very briefly on it? I think one of the critical things with Camp Rylea, not getting into the footprint of the site or anything, but the PacWave sites are deep water sites, and in order to be supportive of the wave energy industry in general and to encourage testing, one of the pieces that's completely missing with PacWave is a shallow water ability, and OSU does have a memorandum of agreement with Oregon Military about Camp Rylea, but I think losing that ability for shallow water testing would detract from Oregon's status as a leading area for wave energy testing in the world.
And
So let me jump in back to you, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
With what you said, I agree. it seems like to me, if we understand the parameters of the device, whether it's shallow, deep, or wind, we have a lot better chance of creating a successful area than by doing the method here where we just fight over things that are in the future. You see my point? Now looking back, this is looking backwards into my experience and where I sit today. I've often asked myself, would I make the same decision today if I'd had an opportunity for the testing of these devices? Would I be picking the same locations? And that's why I asked the question.
Yeah. Understood, and again, I think my answer stands, yes, as it applies to Camp Rylea, no as it applies to Nestucca, and no as it applies to Lakeside. Those are commercial development sites. And I think the ship's already sailed, so to speak, on the whole process, right? The zoning of the ocean, where the resources are, the standards that have been set, the expectations that have been set for where marine energy can happen, where it shouldn't happen, where it may happen, all that. I don't know how, I don't know how we can ever revisit that in any substantive way. I think it's ever. You still have something to say there?
No.
Just take the mic.
You're done. It's a subtle reference. So obviously there's a structure out there that exists, and we're obviously going to be constrained. It's going to look something like it does right now. And to me, that's slow and steady is what we ought to be doing, slow and steady, because there's obvious progress. If it maintains the same basic course with some minor course corrections, I think that's fine, and it allows the stability, the certainty, and the investment that's been made. And I wanted to just point out anecdotally, while folks were at the conference this year, about a school bus full of folks went out to Bigger Works, where they are building yet again another wave energy device. It is a massive piece of equipment, and it's going to be deployed in Hawaii. They're building the machine in Oregon, and they're deploying it in Hawaii for testing. And when they're done, their plan is to bring it back to Oregon, retrofit it with a larger turbine, and deploy it at Packway. So it's a very tangible. When we see it in person, it's a very tangible, because it's just massive, example of Oregon's advantage and some of the benefits that we're starting to see from our efforts and investments over the years. Thank you.
Karen's gonna have the last word before lunch.
Wow. So I wanted to bring it back to information, and obviously the information about the resources and the uses for this plan are central to how we've been trying to chart our way forward. And in thinking about revisiting all of that information, I think that's absolutely a wise thing to do on a periodic basis. And if we get an application today, it doesn't say that we can't use the information that's come to light in the last 5 years, since 2013. And so, I don't want anyone to kind of walk away from this meeting saying, oh my goodness, the last data that we have in hand is 2013. That's not the way that it works. The way that it works is that we go to core resources that we have, like the 2013 plan and the data layers that were there. And we add everything that's come in that's best available science and that's relevant to the question at hand since then. But we do need to revisit some of those data layers at some point in the future. That would be a valuable exercise. So I just wanted to make sure that that was kind of clear in people's thinking. And then to Jason's point about the information that's been collected on the Packwave South site and the North site and Camp Rylea and all of those pinpoints of information that are out there, those are really valuable, obviously need to be integrated, but one of the fundamental principles of the Nearshore Ecological Data Atlas that Dave described was that each of the data layers that went into that were ideally statewide data layers, right? So if we knew about a abundance of a species in one location and we didn't know anything about the abundance of that species everywhere else in the territorial sea, a data set was not valuable because we weren't informing the entire spatial plan. And so just thinking about that in terms of our thoughts as OPAC of supporting monitoring in the state and how we move forward and, research needs, information needs as a policy advisory body, I think that's a frame of reference that's valuable and should stay at the forefront of how we're thinking about things. But that's it.
So, Gina, before lunch, I just like the, Terry's question to Jason, I thought was really important about the testing. But, I was thinking about that, and I remember during the process in which we were selecting these REFSA sites, it was getting into late 2012, early 2013. The process as far as selecting the PMEC site was going on, so we knew that hypothetically or potentially there was going to be a test site somewhere, either in the Reedsport area or in the Newport area. Those were the two finalists. So that was on the radar. Maybe all the permitting and everything that Dan has worked on didn't occur, but to say that that wasn't on the radar, it was on the radar. It just wasn't going to come to fruition. So testing was always part of the mix, and now we're seeing it happening, but it was part of the mix back in 2012 as far as how it was going to be moving forward into the next decade.
All right, with that, I want to thank our panelists, encourage you to stick around. I'm sure there's other questions people would like to ask you offline. And there will also be public testimony after this, and we'll discuss a little bit of next steps. So if you're able to stay, you're welcome that. If not, I understand. I do want to say we're going to come back here. Lunch is over here. We're going to come back in about 20 to 25 minutes. For our working lunch, what we're going to work on is Terry. So we know this is your last meeting. We know it's your last meeting, and so we'd like to say a few words and focus on you for a few minutes before we go back to business. So get your lunch, come back, and then we'll
If we're going to be,
Excuse me, the panelists and the audience can have lunch.
if we're going to be roasting here, I might stick around.
Thanks, Lorinda.
Very important, and
That's why I actually worked